Hi.
Hello.
Okay.
Hi. Okay, great. We can see you and hear you. Hi, everyone. It's Alexandra Bologna. I'm a board member with Black Professionals in International Affairs, and I'm your host of BPIA Chat. I hope that everyone is staying safe and lifted during this time. Our BPIA Chat series hopes to share the experiences and insights of members in the international affairs community and hopefully inspire the next generation to explore opportunities in the field. So the thoughts and views of our guest speakers are their own and do not reflect the views of BPIA. And we are currently streaming live, and this talk will be posted to our IGTV and YouTube channel afterwards. So if you haven't already, please follow Black Professionals in International Affairs on Instagram at IABPIA, as well as follow our guest speaker, whose handle can be found in the flyer on our page of their talk. And lastly, we encourage viewers to chime in below in the thread with their comments and questions. So without further ado, I will introduce and share the biography of our guest speaker. So Taylor Redick is currently policy analyst at the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs, where she works on matters related to sub-Saharan Africa and human rights. Through her work, she has traveled to Southern and West Africa to discuss democracy, labor, and trade. She also regularly leads interagency and NGO non-governmental organization meetings. Taylor completed her master's degree at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy, and Washington, D.C., while concentrating in conflict management and international economics, as well as minoring in African studies. In addition to receiving a certification in French proficiency, she was awarded the Boren National Security Education Program Fellowship to study Portuguese in Maputo, Mozambique. Taylor is currently an advisory board member of the Africa Policy Accelerator at the Center of Strategic and International Studies. So thank you so much, Taylor, for joining. For those who are watching in the chat, feel free to drop the hand wave emoji to say hello. So I'd like to start off by asking you, firstly, how are things on the Hill right now during this COVID-19 situation?
Hi, so thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here to talk a bit about my experiences. So the COVID situation right now has caused the Hill to be a bit emptier. I, as you see, am working from home right now. You know, a lot of my colleagues right now are working remotely, but I would say that from the international affairs perspective, COVID is very interesting because this is a pandemic, you know, it's a virus that's also affecting American citizens in a way and on a scale that it hasn't in the past. So because I work on African affairs, I'm pretty familiar with the Ebola outbreak that was happening in 2014, and that very much impacted the African continent. But for a lot of everyday US citizens, there wasn't as much awareness of it. So having to deal with this pandemic on a domestic and international front has been something that a lot of, I think, members of Congress have had to deal with, especially for our committee, because they have their constituents that they need to address, but they also, you know, have to deal with the other regions of the world that maybe their subcommittee or the committee as a whole focuses on. And that in itself, I mean, it goes into questions of how is this affecting children out of school, not only in the US, but abroad? How is that affecting conflicts? You know, where maybe different groups are now isolated and they don't have that public diplomacy and ability to come together and talk about issues. It's affecting a lot of parts of life. And so we are just as busy as we have been, but we're unable to meet in person. So definitely a lot of video calls and conference calls over the phone are happening right now.
Zoom, GoToMeets, all of them.
Yeah, all of it.
So what does a typical day as a policy analyst on the Hill, what does that look like?
So I hate when people say there is no typical day, and you know, that happens a lot. But I can say, so I can kind of sort my day into buckets, and any of those things could come up at one time.
Mm-hmm.
Because our committee does oversight of the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. A lot of our day does consist of looking at programming that those agencies are doing and speaking with their government relations folks about the programming that's going on. So if we ever have a question about the programming, or there is something new starting, a new program that they are starting in a different country, we typically will have meetings with them, and some of those are mandated. So we do have some of those meetings that happen on a regular basis, and some are requested. But you know, we work on the Hill. It's also the people's house. So, you know, so I work for a committee, but we do less constituent issues. That's something that would more so be happening in a personal office. But what we do have a lot of is talks with advocacy groups. So any groups working perhaps on refugee issues, women's issues, conflict, anything that, you know, is going to overlap with international affairs, they will come in and talk with us. And although I do focus on a specific region, I would still consider myself a generalist because, right, I'm focusing on 49 different countries, and there are people that can create an entire career out of focusing on one. So those subject matter experts will also come in and kind of point us to, you know, we should be paying attention to this. This is something that we should look to in the short term, long term. So a lot of the day is filled with meetings, whether that's the advocacy community or the interagency generally. But the other part is, right, it's the legislative branch. So we are working on drafting legislation, and that's informed by, right, the other part of the government and that same advocacy community, which is why the meetings are so important. During recess, when the members are typically back in their home states and their offices there, we will occasionally have the opportunity to travel to the regions that we're working in to help keep us informed on issues. So that, you know, at most it's going to happen on a quarterly basis, but we are able to occasionally get out to those regions. So I'd say that's the majority of it: the drafting legislation, taking meetings, the travel, and then of course prepping for hearings for the committee, helping with markups, and helping get through the floor process. So basically all of the members on the committee as staff were helping get their legislation through our committee and into Senate side. Yeah.
This is great background for me to know, particularly because this is kind of new information. As someone who has been on the federal agency side, it can seem like two different worlds sometimes, from what's happening in Congress and on the Hill versus what's happening kind of with the different agencies. So I appreciate you sharing more specifically what that work looks like. I wanted to shout out, I saw one of my board members for BPIA, Cal, hop on, as well as a few other speakers who will be speaking later this week, DeAndre and Byron Williams. So I just wanted to shout them out and say hello. And we currently are speaking to Ms. Taylor Redick. She is a policy analyst with the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Feel free to add any comments in the thread or any questions that you may have in the thread below. So my next question, I want to take it back a little bit, but what originally sparked your interest in the international affairs field?
Sure. So there are a couple of things. I had a very non-traditional path to DC in general. I didn't know when I went to Ohio State for undergrad, and when I was there, I had no idea that I wanted to work in international affairs. So actually, right after I graduated, I was working in public relations for about 2 years, completely unrelated to the work I'm doing now. And working at an agency can be quite stressful. You know, a lot of jobs are, and it wasn't because of the team. It was just, it's a busy work environment. And I was starting to realize, you know, if I'm doing all this work and I'm getting so stressed, maybe it should be for, you know, something bigger. And around that same time, I was working, and one of our clients was, they hold an award ceremony every year for public servants, and they're relatively high profile public servants. And so I was at that ceremony in DC, And it was one of the first times I was in DC. And so to be, at such a big ceremony like that was very inspiring. And one of the people that I was able to talk to and heard speak was Justice Sotomayor. So it's kind of the level of people that were there. And I was so just taken aback by it and already thinking that I wanted to do something different. So that kind of cemented my decision to go into public service. As far as the international affairs part, I had already been studying French from some time, from a young age, from I think a little before I was in my teens. And when I was at Ohio State, I had also studied abroad in Dijon, France. And so it was a bit outside of Paris. And so I got to see, I guess, what quote unquote regular life could look like, typical life was like. And that was kind of my first spark. That's, once you travel, right, you can't stop. And that was it for me. And so when I was looking at shaping a new career based around things that I was inspired by and wanted to do, I knew I wanted something that was focused on international affairs and languages, but also public service. And so it was just, the rest of it was just finding a way to meld the two together.
Thank you. I think it looks like we have some Ohio friends out here. I'm seeing Go Buckeyes, OHIO. My stepdad, he's actually a graduate of Ohio State and he played football there and ended up going pro NFL. Oh. So we have a connection on that. I wanted to give a quick reminder as people are still adding in. Please feel free to comment and add your questions below to Ms. Taylor. So my next question is there anything that you know now that you wish you knew when you first started this career path?
I think, so this is something that I hope I can share with others as well. Getting into international affairs, it's difficult and it's somewhat behind the wall sometimes. I have to say, when I started my master's program, it was more or less a leap of faith at that point because I only knew about the Foreign Service, right? I think a lot of people, when they say, I want to, I want a career in international affairs, and I don't exactly know how I'm going to get there. I think the only very public facing career a lot of the times is the Foreign Service, right? Going into the State Department and working at an embassy. And I wasn't opposed to that career, but I was vaguely aware that there must have been some other type of career paths, right? Not everybody that is abroad works for an embassy, and so that was difficult. Part of the reason that I went to the school I did was just to see what is the diversity of career options out there. And I think if I had gone in knowing what options there were, it would have been I would have been able to hone in on my interests a lot faster, because you can have a career in international affairs that's focused on development. It could be focused on public diplomacy. It could be focused on economics or defense, or it could be focused on a number of things. And I think that there's a wall up, right? That information is out there, but it's hard to exactly find it. And so I when I do talk to people, I try to tell them about things that are outside of the Foreign Service, because usually when I do talk to people, that's the first thing they say. And I always say, okay, that's great. And I can, completely help, try to help give tips, introduce you to people, but there's, B, C, and D as options as well. And I think that's always been, it would have been helpful to know more about that before I started down this path.
Right. And I like to advise people to do a little research, by Googling or researching, careers in international affairs sectors, industries, because the biggest branches that you have, the public sector, the private sector, and then from those, there's so much intersectionality and crossover and layover as we continue to grow and move into this global, world and economy. So there's definitely, resources out there exist. our website, BPIA, iabpia.org. We have some information on our site. And we are more than happy to direct folks who may have any questions in that way as well. So I'm going to quickly scan the thread to see if there were any questions. You have a shout out from Rissy's World. This is awesome. Go Taylor. Okay. I am not seeing any questions at this time, so I'll keep going because I have plenty of questions to ask. So generally, I've seen that, how do I ask this? How does one navigate a particularly political space on important issues, right? So some federal agencies or nonprofits or organizations or businesses generally work on this, nonpartisan status, or politics aren't really supposed to play a role in that work. So how does that work on the Hill with international affairs, policy, and projects?
Sure. So this is one part of the job that I have now that I had not experienced before. So prior to this role, I had spent some time interning at the State Department, which is a nonpartisan environment. Obviously, in academia, completely nonpartisan, right? They will rip your paper apart if you put your points in it. So this job there's been a huge learning curve for a number of reasons, but a Democratic committee. I am a Democrat, so I am on board with the decisions they're making. I wouldn't have applied if I wasn't. But it's interesting to kind of put a view into what you're doing. And so for me, even when I was interviewing for my position, that was, some of the feedback I've gotten was saying, okay, it seems like you understand the issues, but, this is a Democratic committee where you're working on behalf of the Democratic Party. And so that for me has been a learning curve. But I will say I am lucky in the way that Africa policy is generally very bipartisan. It's typically not difficult to reach a consensus on issues that are affecting sub-Saharan Africa, because right now in Eastern and Southern Africa right now, there's a locust outbreak happening. That is not partisan. Nobody wants there to be a locust outbreak that is affecting food security, right? Everybody is, generally on board for empowering children and women to be educated and find jobs. And so there are some things that aren't bipartisan, but the things that you have to move fast on, right? Usually everybody does want to do something. And so that desire to act can help kind of push some of the partisan issues out of the way if it is a current event. And you can look at the COVID response that's happening right now in domestic policy to see, there's a lot of infighting or arguments that are happening right now, but they're still getting legislation out because it's important enough that it's going to have to push past the partisanness. And I think one thing that was new to me was kind of looking at things from different angles. So, we might both have an issue on both sides of the aisle with, let's say climate change, for example. And, one party could look at it from an economic perspective and one could look at it from a humanitarian perspective. But at the end of the day, you can use either argument to get the funding into the area that you want. And so usually it's just a matter of, kind of twisting something, compromising, and, coming at it from different angles. And maybe there's a different reason that you both started in on this one issue, but it's enough to get to the finish line. But I will say, the partisan nature of the job, being able to look at a decision maybe that the administration makes and just say, well, that was a bad idea. And you can say that because I work for a Democratic committee, and I know that the chairman, my boss, it's been interesting because, because we do oversight of the State Department, the administration, it's part of our jobs to, actually do that oversight in a very thorough way and say, this doesn't make sense, and call people up to kind of explain their way through it or see how money's being spent, why decisions were made. And I mean, that goes to why we have three branches of government and making sure there is that system of checks and balances.
Right. Thank you. So we have one question from our friend Byron Williams with USDA. He is asking, in terms of your career plans in the past, what were your plan B, C, and D, since an international career tends to be difficult to break into, as you say, quote, behind the wall?
Mm-hmm.
So were there other things or areas that you may have been interested in, or different, sectors or field within international affairs that were of interest to you that you were exploring?
Mm-hmm. So when I first finished my, before I finished my program at Hopkins, like everybody that's in their final year, I was just applying to some of everything. I don't know that I had a very specific place that I wanted to be at, but it was more a checklist of, I would love to be based in DC. I would love a job where I could also travel. And I want to make sure that whenever I do end up leaving this position, I have a knowledge of kind of the landscape of international affairs in DC. So I can say, though, I interned for the State Department my second year, and the following semester I interned for the Foreign Affairs Committee. And that was at a time before the House flipped, so the Democrats were still in the minority. So I knew, I thought that there would not be a possibility of me joining the team because it was so small. So immediately after, that's when I did my Boren fellowship, and I was able to go to Mozambique for a bit of time. I think, working in international affairs, you want to make sure that you have as much international experience as you can get. And so I was trying to, in the least stressful way, kill time before I needed to find a job. And so I thought the best way to do that would be to get out of the country. I also, was applying to jobs at the State Department because I had, through my internship and other forms of networking, met people there. But for a lot of DC jobs, in international affairs, you have to be cleared as well. And so I have run into this, and my friends have run into this as well, where you have this, you get a job offer and you're so excited, and then it's tentative, right? And you have to wait for who knows how long. You don't know how long it's going to be for a job. And so then you're in this position of, okay, am I going to accept a job that I could actually want and then just randomly leave them 6 months from now? Or do I just get a short-term job and then be stuck in a weird limbo after that? So for me, I was more so applying to government jobs. So State Department, on the Hill, they're all in the public sector pretty much. I knew that I when I made the decision to come to DC, I wanted to be here for the long term and in the public sector, and I wanted that type of network. And I mean, it is tricky, right? No one gets the first job they want, but I think by me kind of kicking it down the road a bit with the fellowship it helped a lot, right? I was able to gain a language, get some more international experience, and it gave me time to just apply to everything I wanted. And so that was probably a full year of me sending out applications and getting feedback for it. But it was worth it. It was worth it, but it was stressful. Yeah.
Could you tell us more about your Boren experience and what that program is?
Yeah, so the Boren is a national security fellowship. You can do, there's also a scholarship portion. So the only difference is that if you are still in undergrad, you're going to be doing the scholarship, and it's called a fellowship if you're in your master's program. But we were all together. So there's not too much of a distinction once you're already in the program. Because it is a government national security fellowship. It's paid for by the government, and the only requirement is that after you finish the program, you are required to work for the government for a certain amount of time, and that depends on the length of time that you were out of the country. Of course, the main thing is that it's a language fellowship. And so you're learning what they would call a critical language or a difficult language. So you can't take their funding to go to, I believe it's Western Europe and Australia. You have to go somewhere else. And right, so you're going to spend that time immersed in a language program, and when you come out, they want you to work they want you to work in the national security arena. And so you have to figure out if you want to make that commitment. But because I knew I wanted to work for the government in the first place, it wasn't too much of a choice for me. I would really encourage everyone to do it if they have the opportunity. The only thing is that you technically still have to be enrolled in school. Okay. So for me, when I did it, I finished all my coursework, turned in my thesis, and I told my professors I was considering doing this fellowship program. And so I finished I technically finished in December, but I had all my coursework in by May. So they just waited to put in that final grade at the end of it, so it still looked like I was enrolled. And that's something that, if your school is already aware of the fellowship program, they already know that that's something they can do, and it's pretty commonly done from what I've heard. It's a bit of a loophole that everyone is aware of. But yeah, so I did that program, and I was living in Maputo, Mozambique, and I was at school there at one of the main universities. And our program was, we were only in classes with each other. So I was with the other Boren fellows learning Portuguese, and we also had language partners that were just, local students that were going to that were helping out with our program. And so we became friends very quickly. It was some other women about my age, and they would just, we would hang out outside of school, and it was a great way to get acclimated. And that was so far the only time I've lived on the continent. So that was just a really great experience. That was the first time I had actually traveled to sub-Saharan Africa too. So it was just a complete, like a huge learning experience for me. And I've been back since then, but that was the first time. And
did you experience any culture shock, or what was your experience like in Africa in Mozambique when you were there?
Sure. So we had host families. There was absolutely a culture shock, right? It's not as if I was able to go to class and then come back to maybe my own home or a dorm or anything like that and decompress, right? You're going back home to, a family, a typical Mozambican family. And so it's kind of like your mind's thinking in a different language the entire time. And I would say it wasn't the first time I had experienced culture shock, I guess. So in that way, I was prepared to feel a little uneasy, I guess. I kind of knew what to expect. I knew how to expect how to feel, if that makes sense, right? Like the experiences were different, but that feeling of, wow, like, I can't go home, I'm here, this is my new normal, how am I going to cope with this? All those feelings I was prepared to feel. So in a way I was ready for it. But I would just say, I think, kind of learning a new map of an area, figuring out how to walk to school, forms of public transportation, the different foods, different, how close or far away people are from each other is different by country, and just getting used to all of that again. There was definitely a culture shock, but I would say it didn't last too long. I expected it to last a little longer, but I can't say that after, maybe like less than maybe 3 weeks or so, it wasn't too bad. I was pretty acclimated.
And how long? You said you were there for a year?
No. This was a 6-month program.
6 months. Okay.
I was there for about 4 months.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Yeah, as our speaker yesterday, Miss Cordelia, she spoke on emotions and positivity and has traveled a lot, and suggested that folks should welcome the challenge, welcome and explore those feelings or uncomfortable moments that folks may be experiencing when it's like a first time abroad experience. So we have a shout out to Boren, Mozambique from Odie. Odie got you rocking. Hey Otis, our friend at that state. And then another watcher has asked, did you choose African affairs specifically?
Yeah, so yes, at SAIS, I did minor in African affairs. I chose that like I said, I had already been speaking French and kind of passed my proficiency in that. And after having both studied in France and then studied in Italy with my master's program, I was just, I was looking for an opportunity to kind of use a language in a different part of the world. And it's like, where else are people speaking French? Or if on the off chance that I pick up another Romance language, which I was kind of thinking about learning Portuguese anyways, I was like, where could I use that too that is not Europe? Because I want to go look somewhere else. And the more that I was studying African affairs in grad school, there's some of everything on the continent. I'm not exactly sure how to explain it, but from the academic sense, when you're looking at when you're looking at development issues or trade and investment, when you're looking at great power competition, you can always find a reference for that on the continent somewhere, right? And when you're looking at emerging democracies and new countries, and it's just everything is on the continent. I became so interested in it because it's a great place to have so many different case studies, and there's so many different cultures on one continent. And so I knew that was something that I was interested in pursuing in my career. That's not to say that's the only region of the world I'm interested in, but I thought it was a great, at least starting point for a career, because you'd be able to cover such a multitude of topics. So when I interned for the Foreign Affairs Committee, every intern, they send out their bio to all of the senior staff. And you say, what you're studying and what you're interested in. And on mine was, it said that I was minoring in Africa affairs. So I spent a lot of time with the Africa staffer. And so she was actually the one who reached out when they were hiring up, when the house did flip, because they were looking for like some middle level staff. And because those were new positions, I mean, we hadn't had the house in 8 years. So we had to create a whole new level of jobs, and so they had reached out to me, and so I had already affairs, but I do also on committee work on human rights, not specific to Africa. That could be anywhere.
Thank you for sharing that. Another viewer asked, what was your favorite Mozambican dish?
Oh, definitely. There were a lot of good. Everybody, I think, when you ask if they've been there, they talk about the prawns, because they're so big. They're like as big as your hand. They're gigantic.
Wow.
They can be, and they're really great. But the grilled octopus was great. The lulas are my favorite. They're just these like beautiful little rings that are grilled, and they have butter on them, and they're so good. But it's not, it should not be surprising that in that coastal capital, the seafood is everybody's favorite. Yeah.
So before we wrap, I have one more question. And then following this question, Taylor, feel free to share any concluding thoughts or comments that you may have. But the question is, what advice would you give to someone who is considering this type of job or the field that you're in?
I think, if you're the type of person that would tune in to a talk on BPIA, you've probably already heard the typical kind of advice of make sure you're networking and make sure you're going out for those informational interviews, and that advice does apply here. I would say, I guess, maybe one thing that's unique to DC, and then one thing that's unique to international affairs. For DC, I think more than other places, it is particularly useful to join professional groups because, you know, everyone, it is easier to form that connection and form that network if you have some type of a tight kind of relationship with someone. And at DC, just there's so many different groups you can join here that it, you know, for all different age groups and demographics and interests. If you're not in any of them, I don't know. It's rare that I meet someone that's not in at least 3 or 4 groups. So if you're really interested in professional development, I would say try to join, and you know, at least 2 should be helpful, because that connection is going to come in handy down the road when you know, people are making hiring decisions and they're like, oh yeah, that person I know that is in this organization with me, they'd probably be great. And honestly, every organization I'm in, they have their job boards, they have their listservs, and so it's a great way if you're looking, you know, if you're looking for a job, they'll always have them posted there. But for international affairs specifically, I cannot overstate the importance of making sure that you have traveled and lived abroad, in addition to, you know, having that coursework or having that internship or past work experience. It is very hard to create an argument for yourself that you would be great at a career in international affairs, foreign policy, or, you know, whatever path you're taking, if you've never spent any time out of the country. And obviously that is it's a privilege, right? Not everybody can do that. It's really hard sometimes to either find the funding or the time to be able to leave the country, especially if there's other people that you're supporting, or, you know, you just don't have that saved up. But I would say where you can find those fellowships, scholarships, opportunities, if you're already in debt because you're in school, you know, usually you can work with your financial aid office to get you to also go abroad. You know, find a way for the government to pay for it, which is what I did. You know, I would encourage you as much as you can, find a way to get out of the country, or else it's hard to say, you know, I studied this and this, but I would also be really great at doing policy in this country that I've, you know, never been to. It's difficult. So I would say make that your priority if you can.
Taylor, thank you so much for speaking to us today. And thank you to everyone who was here and tuned in. Please follow us, BPIA, on our Instagram at IABPIA. And you can also find Taylor's handle and information on the flyer that is on our page. And we are thankful for our speaker who has graciously shared her time and background and knowledge with us today. And we look forward to seeing folks at future BPIA chats.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And if anyone does have any questions or does want to connect, I have a lot more free time now that I am working remotely. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to send it.
Sounds good. Alrighty. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.